Hello, and welcome to the Graphics and Visual Principles presentation. In this presentation, we're going to discuss a number of issues related to integrating graphics and visuals into the teaching and learning environment, as well as some more technical issues associated with the development of graphics and visual images. So, why use images in the teaching and learning environment? Take a minute, pause this presentation, and come up with some reasons on why images might be used. Well, first, there's the dual coding theory, and the dual coding theory explores how the mind processes information and states that there is a verbal subsystem and a visual subsystem, and the way in which the mind processes each of these is independent and different. However, providing verbal messages and visual messages together can be very effective in the teaching and learning environment, provided that they do not compete with one another. Associated with this is the idea of multimodal learning, and multimodal simply means presenting information in multiple modes. And one of the benefits of this is that a wider audience is reached. Many times you may have heard of visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners. Well, providing information in addressing these multiple modes is one way to reach wider audiences. Now, we'll talk about the visual, kinesthetic, and auditory learners later, and some issues related to that, but that's the basic idea here. Also, images can provide some level of redundancy. So if you have text on a screen, you can support that text with various images. If you have video, you can use images to support that video, and vice versa. And lastly, images can provide reference information. And what this essentially means is that complex topics can be simplified through the use of imagery. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on in this presentation. When integrating images into the teaching and learning environment, there are a variety of issues to consider. Take a moment, pause this presentation, and think about some issues that you might need to consider when integrating images into the teaching and learning environment. Well, one image is visual literacy, and visual literacy deals with the ability to decode visual images and encode visual images. And visual literacy is much like the traditional literacy, is very important to how images are both created and developed, and how image messages using images are decoded or interpreted. So it's very important to address the visual literacy issue when integrating images. Now, related to this is the audience, and with that, there are a series of audience issues that will impact their ability to decode and encode various images. First are audience experiences. So what kind of experiences has the audience members undergone? If you are bringing in something from another culture, for example, would they have an understanding of what that item is? Would they know how to decode more complex images and schematics and things like that? So much like we talked about during the web design process and dealing with technology, you also need to consider audience experiences when dealing with imagery. What is their developmental level? What are their visual preferences? So there are a variety of other issues to consider when integrating images. And many of these relate directly to the audience. One example of this is Heathrow Airport. In Heathrow Airport, they have a series of 3 images. As you walk along, there's chunks of 3 images. And what the images are an image, text, and usually a country. And one example of this is they had a cricket. Or actually, let's look at another example. They had a football. And they had England, and they had a soccer ball. They had the U.S., and they had a United States football. And then they had Australia and an Australian rules football. Now, that's one example, but there you can see how different audience members would interpret what football means based on their experiences, their culture, etc. The cricket example I was mentioning earlier, it had three crickets, and it had the United States, pest, it had another country, delicacy or food, and then it had another country where the cricket was a religious icon. So there are a lot of issues like that to consider when creating images and using them in the teaching and learning environment. So let's look at some of the issues we've discussed already. So what are the goals of visual design? Well, the first is to ensure legibility, and what that means is that it's easy to read. And this is very important. You want to make it, the user should not have to spend time interpreting what the actual image is. I had a class one time where some of the items were out of print, and the images that appeared were very difficult to break down because they were such poor quality because the item was no longer created. Next is to reduce effort, and this is somewhat related to the legibility issue, but reducing effort in interpretation allows them to focus, the user to focus on the message, which is important. You also want to create or increase active engagement, so use images as a motivational tool, or make them use them to draw in the audience, make them appealing, make the topic or the content appealing, and then use them to focus attention. It's very easy to use images to highlight important messages. So when reading, many times it's difficult for students, especially students with limited experience with the content, to determine what's important versus what's not important, or what's more important versus what's less important. Well, you can use images to make this more clear and highlight what's important versus what's more important versus what's less important. Next, let's look at the processes of visual design. And here we have elements, and as far as elements go, we're looking at analogic elements, organizational or realistic. So is it realistic versus not being realistic? Is it pictorial? Is it graphic? Is it verbal? So what kind of visual design are you doing? Patterns and arrangement we're going to talk about more in the next few slides, but patterns, we're looking at balance, the shape, implementing the rule of thirds and where the eye is drawn around the screen, alignment, the color scheme, the color appeal. As far as arrangement goes, we're looking at proximity, direction, contrast, consistency, all of these visual design issues, and we'll talk about these more later on. So let's look at some visual planning tools. So as we are creating visuals, we want to plan these out, and as you will continue to discuss in this program, storyboarding, determining the types of letters, drawing, sketching, cartooning, essentially mapping out your visuals is going to be very important and very useful to you to simplify the actual development process. And this is a theme that we'll continue to discuss throughout. And then there are also a number of ways of acquiring digital images and visuals. One would be through digital cameras, simply taking pictures, using scanners of hard copied images, so if you find something in a textbook or something along those lines, photo CDs, using online resources. One thing to consider, though, when using images is copyright, so it's very important to follow copyright, and also be cautious when editing images. It's important to understand what you're doing, maybe even have multiple copies of the digital images, have one as sort of a sandbox, play around with kind of image, and other one as a backup to that image in case you make a mistake and kind of get it beyond repair. So let's look at some other issues to consider. And here we've talked about visual design and this idea of the rule of thirds. Well, the rule of thirds states that rather than centering items on the screen, the eye moves around the screen in a particular manner and focuses on specific areas on the screen more than others. You can see here that clearly the upper left-hand third is where the eye begins scanning and focuses more attention. As you move around, you can see the other percentages as well. So Oftentimes, centering an item is not the best way to go. Sometimes it's okay, but you want to consider visual design and where the eye is drawn when developing visual images. Next is balance. Now, there are three real formats of balance here, and these provide a sense of equilibrium. The formal balance is something that's often used and definitely used more in formal situations. Another balance, and which is actually the best of the three and is more dynamic and more engaging, is an informal balance. And essentially this means that everything is not exactly centered on the screen, but larger images are further away, smaller images are closer to the center, and each quadrant has a relatively similar amount of visual imagery. And then last is an imbalance, and we want to avoid this, and this is where one side of the screen has all the images, the other side has text, and there is this clear imbalance. Next is the overall pattern, and a number of issues to consider here are alignment, and we've already talked about alignment and selecting one alignment and staying to it. One thing that I often see is a center alignment. Sometimes centering images and content on a page is fine. Other times it's very difficult to read and distracting, so consider that. Shape, one thing you want to consider with shapes is using familiar shapes. Balance, we talked about previously. Style, color scheme, and color appeal are all issues we've talked about in the past, and these are important to the overall effectiveness of using visuals. Arrangement, here again we're looking at proximity issues, so how far is an image from an item that it is related to or unrelated to, and that will provide a sense of connectivity between different images and content on the screen. Directionals, so using arrows and different things of that nature to highlight various aspects of the content and of the image. Figure ground contrast, and again we've always talked about this idea of being consistent throughout. One nice planning tool is a storyboard card, and this is something that you often do when developing video, and we'll talk about that more, or when you're designing a website. Well, you also want to do it when developing visuals. So here you have a visual. Down below you might have some text associated with that visual, and then on the right some production notes related to it. And this will help you kind of align and provide the appropriate orientation of your image in the setting that it's going to be used. Okay, so we've talked about some of the issues related to visuals and graphics, and that's just a continuation of some of the items that we've talked about before. Here we're going to talk about some of the technical issues, specifically file formats related to images. So the first file format is a JPEG, and this is something most of y'all are familiar with. And JPEG stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group. This is a very good file format for photographs. However, it is typically not very good with letters, and they often appear very blurry. Another issue with JPEGs is that they tend to deteriorate over generations. So this idea of making a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy isn't very effective with JPEGs. And the reason for that is it is a lossy file format, meaning that it loses quality over time. One of the benefits of JPEGs is that it is a compressed file, so they are typically small files, which can be good for use on web pages. And another thing is you can control that compression depending on which image editor you use. For example, in Photoshop, you can compress it significantly or compress it less than you might want to, and that will influence the file size, but also the overall quality of the image. So if you have a JPEG and quality is an issue, then you can provide less compression to make it a more clear image. Next is the GIF or graphic interchange format, and this is useful for images with transparent backgrounds as well as animations. So if you have an image that has a transparent background and you save it as a JPEG, that background is going to come up as a white image. Well, with a GIF file, that image will come up transparent. So if I have a person, for example, and they have a white background behind them, and I make it transparent in the photo image editor, and I want that to show up as just the person on my blue web page background, I would use the GIF file format because that's going to show the transparency and it'll blend in with the blue. However, if I saved it as a JPEG, I'm going to have that white square or whatever shape it is there as well, and that's going to make it difficult to integrate into my website effectively. GIF files are lossless images, meaning that they do not lose any quality, and they are still compressed files, while not as compressed as other file formats. So you don't have the issue here of generations deteriorating. Next is a PNG file, or portable network graphics file, and one of the issues with this is that it does not work well with, or work at all with, older graphics. But there are a couple of benefits to this. One is that there are different levels of transparency, unlike GIFs. So with GIF files, the issue is that it's either transparent or not transparent. Well, with PNG files, you can provide levels of transparency. And PNG files were created specifically for the web, and so this levels of transparency was one of the aspects of it that made it useful for the web. But also, they're very compressed and they retain their quality. So the loss of quality is not an issue, and file size is not an issue. And again, these were designed for web publication, which makes file size not as much of an issue, and the quality issue with JPEGs is not an issue either. Photoshop documents, or PSD documents, are very useful for editing images. These are very large files. There is no compression, but they are excellent quality. Also, they retain layers. So if I have a multi-layered image, then I would say if I save it as a PSD, those layers are going to come up next time I want to open that file and make any edits. Typically, PSD files are not used on the web, and one, because they're huge, and secondly, there's really no benefit to having PSD files on the web. You can still get excellent quality in other more compressed file formats. These are used oftentimes in print documents, but also retained for editing. So if I create a PSD document, I want to save one for future editing, but I also may save one as a JPEG or a GIF or a TIFF for publication, or PNG for publication to the web. So having those PSD documents there is very useful. Next is a TIFF file, or a tagged image file format. And these are not very compressed, but there are a variety of different types of these. These are really good for scanned images. And you'll see a lot of scanners actually save files as TIFF files. And lastly are bitmaps, which are very large files, and you may have seen these in the past. They're mediocre quality, but bitmaps are kind of going away now, and you'll see that many web browsers will not even open bitmaps anymore. So you do not want to use a .bmp file for your web publication. While there are a variety of image file types, there are also a number of image types. The first is pixelated images versus vector images. Vector images are images that retain their aspect ratio or their appearance no matter what size they are. So I can make a vector image very large and it still retains all of its image qualities. Whereas with a pixelated image, I can drag it and make it a larger image, and I oftentimes will get a very pixelated result. So vector images use mathematical formulas to maintain the various aspect ratios of their images. Next are image maps, and image maps are images that are hyperlinked to other types of content, and it may be another hyperlink, or it may be another web resource, it may be another size of an image, or it may be an alt label. And there are some issues related to server side and client side that you need to explore in your book. And next are images as backgrounds, and you can use vertical images and horizontal images, but images as backgrounds can be very useful in web design and in graphic design to draw the user into the document and into the content. and we're going to get into this more. Now, one issue with this is you do not want to have typically a image as your entire background. You don't want to have sort of a multiple image background where it's sort of a checkerboard kind of thing. You want to have a single image, maybe as a banner or something along those lines, and utilize that as your background. We'll get into this more as we continue the course in the program. Well, this concludes our images presentation. As always, have a great week, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.